The wind howled through the husks of abandoned West Detroit, a city that had once hummed with life, but now lay like a ghost. Snow settled on cracked asphalt, pooling in the corners of vacant lots where rusted cars jutted out like tombstones. Flickering streetlights cast ragged shadows on boarded-up storefronts and houses sagging under the weight of neglect. The cold wasn't just piercing, it bit into your bones, freezing every last spark of warmth out of you. Raymond Carter walked through it, his breath steaming, his gloved hands shoved deep into the pockets of his old leather jacket. His boots crunched on the icy sidewalk, each step carrying the heaviness of a man who had been beaten down too many times, but still refused to stay on the floor. Raymond was 42, but the lines on his face told the story of an older man. Deep creases around his eyes, old scars along his cheekbones and nose, a broken bridge that had healed poorly his face was a map of his life, with every crease representing a round, a defeat, or just a hard day. He had once been a middleweight boxer with a record that never quite matched his equal, always a step behind the glory, but good enough to hold off the favorites. His shoulders were still broad and his stride confident, but there was a heaviness to it, as if he carried not only his own weight, but the weight of his years. He had left the ring for a job as a security guard in a half-empty warehouse on the outskirts of town, where the nights smelled of dust, rust, and fatigue. The pay barely covered the bills for electricity and food for him and his son, Liam. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And in a city like Detroit, honesty was a rare coin. Raymond knew the value of things: pain, endurance, silence. He wasn't fighting for titles anymore. He was fighting for Liam to go to school well-fed and not to know what it was like to be afraid of the night. He pushed open the door to his small, shabby duplex on Claremont Street, the hinges creaking as if begging for mercy. Inside, there was only a hint of warmth, the old radiator rattling as if it were on its last legs. Raymond kicked off his shoes, leaving wet footprints on the worn linoleum. The house smelled of damp and the cheap coffee he'd brewed that morning. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim yellow light over the living room, the threadbare sofa, the chipped coffee table, the television that flickered more than it showed. "Liam," Raymond called, his voice rough as gravel. He didn't expect an answer. His son, an 11-year-old boy, locked in his own world, barely spoke. Just a few letters now and then, or phrases repeated from apps on his tablet. "BBB," or TTT, Liam mumbled, his eyes darting around as if he were seeing something no one else could. Autism, the doctors said. Raymond didn't care about the mark. He cared about the boy. His boy, the only piece of his heart that had been beaten since Ellie, his wife, had died in a slippery road accident 6 months earlier, leaving him a widower and Liam without a mother. Ellie was the light of his life, and not in a poetic sense. She really did have a way of shining. Her laughter, ringing and infectious, seemed to light up a room, no matter how dark it was. She worked as a librarian, loved the smell of paper and evenings with tea and old books. She believed in people, even when she shouldn't have. Raymond often wondered how such a person, gentle, patient, kind, could choose him a man with a rough past and a hard look. But Ellie had always seen more. She was the one who first noticed that something was wrong with Liam, and the one who accepted it not as a tragedy, but as a path different, difficult, but worthy of love. With her, everything was simpler, easier, warmer. Now that she was gone, even the air in the house seemed heavier. But for Liam, he kept going, breathing, living, even through the pain, even slowly. Raymond hung his jacket on a hook by the door and walked across the room into the narrow hallway. The walls were covered with faded photographs: Ellie in a flowing dress, smiling, Liam as a toddler clutching a stuffed dinosaur, Raymond in boxing gloves, young and brash, before the world had taught him modesty. He pushed open the door to Liam's room. The boy was curled up on the bed, his knees pulled up to his chest, his tablet glowing in the dark. A math game played on the screen, numbers swirling in bright colors. Liam's fingers tapped rhythmically, his lips moving silently. "T-T-T-T-T," he muttered, not looking up. "Hey, champ," Raymond said quietly, lowering himself onto the edge of the bed. The springs creaked under his weight. He reached out, paused, then placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Liam didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. He just kept tapping the screen. Raymond's chest tightened. He would have given anything for one real conversation, for Liam to look him in the eye and say, "Dad, I'm okay." But it didn't work that way. Not for them. "Did you eat the sandwich I left?" Raymond asked, knowing the answer. The plate sat untouched on the nightstand, the bread dry around the edges. He sighed, rubbing his neck, where it throbbed from the long shift. "Gotta eat, kid. Don't want you to get too skinny." Liam's fingers paused for a second, then began tapping again. The tablet made a cheerful ringing sound that seemed alien in the heavy silence. Raymond stood, his knees cracking, and took the plate. "I'll make you a new one. Come on." In the kitchen, he assembled another sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, Liam's favorite, but only if the crusts were trimmed perfectly. Raymond worked with precision, his calloused hands moving with the precision of a man who had once danced in a ring. The knife cut smoothly, as if cutting away the day's hardships. He glanced at his watch. 8:47 p.m. tomorrow would be another 12-hour shift. Another night wondering if he was enough for Liam. The phone rang, a sharp sound cutting through the silence. Raymond wiped his hands on a tea towel and grabbed the receiver from the table. "Yes?" "Ray, it's Tommy." The voice on the other end was the same as the old days, raspy, tired, but with that eternal note of levity, as if life were just another round. "What are you doing there?" "Home, I suppose." "Where else would I be?" Raymond replied dryly, glancing down the dark hallway where the light from Liam's tablet screen flickered in the distance. "Listen, come to the hole. We'll sit with the guys, reminisce about the past, the beer's cold, the music's not too dull. We'll live as best we can. We'll miss you." Raymond pressed his lips together. His fingers tapped nervously on the tabletop. "Not going to happen, Tommy. I have Liam." "Then take him with you. Give him headphones, a tablet. He won't even notice what's around. You've completely gone nuts, bro. At least for an hour, huh?" Raymond said nothing. The idea of going out at night with a child who had trouble being in his own room, let alone in a noisy bar, seemed wrong. And why bother? Drinking with tired men, listening to the same stories? "No, not today," he said, a little more softly. "Thank you, Tommy." "As you wish, brother. But you know yourself you can't sit locked up forever. Okay? If you change your mind, we'll be here until late." The line went dead. Raymond stood there, holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. Then he put it back and exhaled. Too much silence, too many thoughts. But he knew where he needed to be, home, with Liam. Detroit was suffocating under the weight of a winter morning, where the gray sky merged with the smoke from the factory chimneys and the frost bit at your skin like a hungry animal. Raymond Carter walked along the icy sidewalk, his breath coming out in short puffs, dissolving into the cold air. Liam, his son, trudged along beside him, hunched over his tablet, his fingers tapping rhythmically across the screen where bright numbers flashed. As Raymond walked back from his walk, he heard Liam mutter something that was almost lost in the howling wind. "Mama loved Uncle James." The words, spoken in a low, almost ghostly voice, had stuck in Raymond's head like a rusty nail, and now they would not let him rest, spinning in his head like a broken record. Uncle James. James Carter, Raymond's younger brother, was a man he hadn't seen since Ellie had died 6 months earlier. Their last meeting had been brief and bittersweet at Ellie's funeral, when James had appeared like a shadow, late, his suit rumpled, his eyes full of something Raymond couldn't quite place. They'd barely exchanged a few words, and James had vanished, as if he'd never been there. No call, no letter, nothing. Raymond hadn't bothered to look for him then, his grief and concern for Liam consuming him. But now Liam, a boy who rarely managed more than TTT or single letters, had suddenly mentioned James. It was a punch to the jaw from which Raymond could never recover. They reached an old Ford parked at the side of the road, its rusty sides glistening with frost, as if it had cried with the city. Raymond opened the back door and Liam climbed in, his eyes glued to his tablet. The screen glowed, reflecting in his wide eyes as he tapped at the Numbers app. "Mummy loved Uncle James," Liam repeated, his voice soft, almost sing-song, as if he were speaking not to his father, but to a memory. Raymond froze, his hand gripping the door. "What did you say, champ?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even, but his throat was as dry as a desert. Liam didn't answer, just muttered his usual t-t-t-t, and went back to his tablet. Raymond slammed the door, walked around the car, and got behind the wheel. His fingers gripped the wheels so tightly the skin on his knuckles stretched. He didn't know what to make of the phrase, but it was stuck in him like a splinter he couldn't get out. Ellie and James. They'd never been close. Ellie tolerated him for Raymond's sake, but her smile always tightened when James showed up with one of his schemes. Or so it seemed to Raymond. Now he doubted everything. At home, in their cramped, cold apartment, Raymond put Liam to bed. The boy was curled under the covers, the tablet lying next to him, its weak light casting shadows on the walls. Raymond stood in the doorway, looking at his son, trying to remember the last time Liam had spoken of anyone other than Ellie. She was his world, her voice, her warmth, able to draw him out of the silence, even if only for a moment. But James was a stranger, a shadow who had flitted through a funeral and then vanished. Why did Liam remember him? And what did it mean to love him? Raymond walked into the living room, where the dim light from the bulb flickered, as if it were afraid to stay in the house. He collapsed on the sofa, his body aching from the long shift, but his thoughts were troubling him. He stood up and went to the old dresser where Ellie kept her things. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of bills and old receipts, was her tin box, worn and peeling, full of what she called pieces of life. Raymond hadn't opened it since the funeral. It was too painful, like opening an old wound. But now, with Liam's words echoing in his head, he knew he had to. He sat down on the floor, setting the box in front of him like a chest of secrets that could destroy him. There were pictures inside. Ellie at the lake, her hair shining in the sun, Liam building a tower of blocks, the three of them at a fair where Raymond had won a stuffed lion for his son. He flipped through the pictures, his fingers shaking, as if afraid to find something out of place. In one, he spotted James, standing next to Ellie at a family barbecue, his hand on her shoulder, the smile that always meant trouble. Raymond frowned. Ellie looked. Not awkward exactly, but her smile was different, cautious, like she was hiding something. He put the photos aside and dug deeper. Old postcards, movie tickets, a note from Ellie reminding him to buy milk. And then he found a small notebook, tattered, the cover faded. Ellie liked to write things down, to-do lists, recipes, random thoughts. Raymond opened it, his heart beating faster with each page. Most of the entries were mundane. Doctors for Liam, birthday plans, notes about work. But one line stopped him in his tracks. Meeting Jay, Tuesday, 3 p.m. The date was a month before the accident. Raymond stared at the entry, his fingers tightening around the pad, the paper crumpling under the pressure. James? Why was Ellie dating him? They barely spoke. Ellie always kept her distance from James, her eyes growing cold when he started talking about easy money. Or so it seemed to Raymond. He scrolled further, but found no other mention of James. Just that line, a beacon in the darkness, pointing to something he couldn't quite place. He closed the box and stood, his thoughts swirling like the snow outside his window. James had disappeared after Ellie's funeral, as if the city had swallowed him up. But now his name was back, and Raymond couldn't just let it go. Liam knew something or felt something, and it was connected to James. Raymond had to find out what. The morning came, cold and gray as Detroit concrete. The sun didn't even try to break through the thick clouds. There was no warmth or hope in it. Raymond stood on Mrs. Glover's porch, his head tucked into the collar of his jacket, while Liam walked beside him, clutching his tablet like a life preserver. He didn't complain about the cold. He didn't complain at all. He just muttered to himself and tapped at the screen with the concentration of a surgeon. Mrs. Glover opened the door before he knocked, as if she had been waiting. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back into a bun, and she held a steaming cup in her hand, tea or coffee. Raymond could not tell. There was a tired warmth in her eyes, a patience that was rare even among mothers, let alone neighbors. "Come in, boys," she said, retreating inside. Liam walked past without a word and sat down in his usual spot, the far corner of the couch under a knitted blanket. The screen of his tablet flashed, and he immediately began scrolling, tapping icons. Raymond lingered in the doorway, staring at his son as if he might disappear or dissolve into the pixels of the screen. And suddenly Liam said, "Mama loved Uncle James." He did not look up. His voice was even almost mechanical, as if he were repeating a phrase he had heard somewhere. But there was silence in the room. Mrs. Glover turned her head slowly toward Raymond, her eyebrows raised. "He's never said that before," she said quietly, as if afraid to spoil the moment. Does that mean something, Ray?" Raymond felt his insides tighten. The name James sounded like glass crunching underfoot. He looked away, frowned, and hid the trembling behind a tense jaw. "I don't know," he muttered, more sharply than he intended. He took a step toward the door, then stopped. "Just keep an eye on him. I'll be back this evening." Mrs. Glover nodded, but her gaze was intense, searching. Over the years, she had learned to read between the lines and knew when a man was going out on more than just business. Raymond stepped down the steps, zipping his jacket up to his chin. The wind was hot on his face, but it was colder inside. He walked out, feeling Liam's words burning inside him like embers that couldn't be put out. Mom loved Uncle James. What did that mean? Ellie and James had never been close. She tolerated him for Raymond's sake, but always kept her distance, her smile turning cold whenever he showed up with another escapade. Or was there something Raymond hadn't noticed? Doubt, like rust, was beginning to eat away at his memories. He headed to the old gym on Grand River where he and James had once trained. The building looked like it was about to collapse, but the inside still smelled of sweat and the leather of boxing gloves. Coach Mac, an old man with a face as lined as an old pear, was yelling at a newbie who couldn't hold his own. "Raymond Carter," Mac muttered when he spotted him. "Are you still dragging your bones around this town?" "Holding on for now," Raymond replied, shaking his hand. "Looking for James. Hear anything?" Mac frowned, rubbing his chin. "Your brother? Saw him at your wife's funeral, but he kind of disappeared after that. He came in here a couple times before, blabbering about some deal. Casino, real estate, something like that. Sounded like his usual crap." "Where is he now?" Raymond tried to speak evenly, but his fists clenched. Mac shrugged. "I heard he got involved with some shady types, maybe around Cass Avenue. There's a club there, the Red Veil. But Ray, stay away from there. It's not your ring." The Red Veil. The name floated up like a warning, and Raymond felt his pulse quicken. He thanked Mac and walked out, his thoughts heavier than the weights at the gym. James and Ellie. What was their connection? And why did Liam, a boy who barely spoke, suddenly remember his name? The next step was more difficult. Raymond went to see Sarah, an old friend of Ellie's who worked at the library on Woodward Avenue. Sarah was one of the people who knew Ellie best. They had shared secrets since high school. If anyone could shed light on Ellie's connection to James, it was her. The library was quiet, smelling of old books and dust. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, but her eyes were tired. "Ray," she said, her voice warm, but with a hint of surprise. "Haven't seen you in a while. How's Liam?" "It's holding up," Raymond replied, leaning against the counter. "Sarah, I need to ask. Has Ellie ever talked about James, my brother?" Sarah frowned, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "James? Your brother. I don't remember her talking about him much. She mentioned him a couple of times, but nothing major. Why do you ask?" Liam said something strange. Raymond lowered his voice, his eyes watching her reaction. He said, "Mummy loved Uncle James. Do you know what that might mean?" Sarah looked away, her fingers fiddling nervously with her pen. "Liam said that? That's weird. Ellie, she didn't like James. I mean, she tolerated him, but she always said he was trouble. Although she hesitated. A couple of months before the accident, she mentioned seeing him, said he'd asked to see her, but she didn't go into detail. Raymond felt his heart sink. Where? When? I don't know, Ray. Sarah shook her head. She didn't want to talk. She just said it was personal. I thought maybe he was in some kind of scam again and was asking for help. Raymond nodded, but inside his mind was spinning. Personal. What could be personal between Ellie and James? He thanked Sarah and walked out, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying Detroit on his shoulders. James had met Ellie before she died, and disappeared right after. It wasn't a coincidence. When Raymond got home, he found Liam on the couch, still holding his tablet. The boy looked at him, his eyes clear but distant. Mummy loved Uncle James, he said again, and Raymond felt his resolve hardened. He didn't know what was behind those words, but he knew one thing. He was going to find James. And if his brother was hiding something about Ellie's death, he was going to shake the truth out of him, even if it meant turning the whole town upside down. Detroit slept under a heavy blanket of night, its streets immersed in shadows where the streetlights cast only dim pools of light, as if the city were afraid to look at itself in the mirror. Raymond Carter sat on the floor of his cramped apartment, surrounded by silence broken only by the creaking of an old radiator. Ellie's tin box lay before him, its battered lid open, revealing memories he had avoided for so long. But tonight he had gone further than usual. Beneath a stack of photographs and old letters, he had found a hiding place, a false bottom hidden by a thin layer of cardboard. There, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was Ellie's diary. Small and bound in tattered leather, it looked like something that held secrets that could destroy everything Raymond knew about his life. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the journal, as if he sensed that opening it would be the point of no return. Liam's words, "Mummy loved Uncle James," still rang in his head, an echo that could not be silenced. Raymond could no longer ignore them. 6 months ago, at Ellie's funeral, he had seen James, his little brother, for the last time. He had appeared like a ghost, his suit rumpled, his eyes full of something Raymond had not been able to discern: guilt, fear, or simply emptiness. They had barely exchanged words, and James had vanished, as if Detroit had swallowed him whole. And now Liam, the boy who lived in his own world, had suddenly pulled James's name out of the past, like a card from a deck. Raymond had to know why. He opened the journal, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it would wake Liam, asleep in the next room. The pages were covered in Ellie's neat handwriting, her words flowing like a river, full of the little details of their lives. Shopping lists, doctor's notes for Liam, plans for the summer. But then he came across an entry that took his breath away. James found a clinic. It's expensive, but he says they can help. I can't tell Ray. He'll never understand. He can't give me a baby, but I can't live without a family. Liam will be ours. I'll do anything to make that happen. Raymond reread the lines, his fingers shaking, the paper crumpling under the pressure. He can't give me a child. The words hit him like a hook to the jaw, a punch he couldn't recover from. He flipped through them, each page a fresh blow. Ellie wrote about her encounters with James, about the money she'd secretly taken from their savings to pay for procedures at a clinic on the outskirts of Detroit. She mentioned James not as Raymond's brother, but as a go-between, someone who knew people who could help. And then the line that tore at his heart. Liam is mine. Ours, not Ray's. I love him, but the truth would break him. Raymond threw the diary down. It hit the floor with a thud. The room spun, the walls closing in on him as if they were trying to crush him. Liam wasn't his son. Ellie, the woman he loved more than life itself, had kept that from him. And James, his own brother, was part of that deception. Raymond stood, his knees shaking, bracing himself against the wall to steady himself. He wanted to scream, to smash everything around him, but there was a lump in his throat and a pain in his chest that no amount of screaming could alleviate. Dad, Liam's voice, quiet and uncertain, came from the darkness of the hallway. The boy stood in the doorway, clutching his tablet, his eyes darting around as if he could sense the storm within his father. "TTT," he muttered, and Raymond felt his heart break. This boy, his son, or was he not, was all he had left, and now even that was a lie. "Go to sleep, baby," Raymond said, his voice raspy, almost alien. Liam nodded and walked away, his steps soft as shadows. Raymond knelt down, picked up the journal, and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. He couldn't stay here, in this apartment, where every corner was soaked with betrayal. He needed to know for sure. The journal was clear, but Raymond couldn't believe it until he saw the truth in black and white. The next morning, Raymond took Liam to Mrs. Glover, the neighbor who was babysitting the boy. Liam was sitting on her couch, his eyes glued to his tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen. "Mummy loved Uncle James," he muttered, without looking up. Mrs. Glover looked at Raymond, her face full of questions. "He said it again," she noted quietly. "What's going on, Ray?" "Nothing," he muttered, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Just keep an eye on him. I'll be back this evening." He walked out, feeling Liam's words and Ellie's notes burning inside him like hot coals. He headed for the hospital on Jefferson Avenue, a gray building that smelled of antiseptic and hopelessness. It was cold inside despite the humming heaters, and Raymond could feel his nerves stretching taut. He walked up to the front desk, where a woman with tired eyes and faded lipstick looked up at him. "I need to get tested," he said, his voice firm but his insides shaking. "Fertility tests, urgent." She looked at him as if she saw men like him every day, men whose worlds crumbled under the weight of the truth. "Fill out the form," she said, handing him the clipboard with the forms. Raymond sat in the corner of the waiting room, his hand shaking as he wrote each letter. He didn't know why he was doing this. Ellie's journal was clear enough. But he had to know. He had to see it on paper to believe that everything he knew was a lie. The doctor, an older man with sparse gray hair and glasses that slid down his nose, took the samples with a businesslike detachment. "The results will be back in a couple of hours," he said, not looking Raymond in the eye. "You can wait here." Raymond couldn't wait. He went outside, where the snow was falling in small, sharp flakes, as if the city was trying to drown out his pain. He wandered to a nearby diner, where the smell of rancid butter mingled with the aroma of cheap coffee. He ordered a black coffee, as bitter as his thoughts, and sat by the window, watching the cars go by. Ellie's journal was in his pocket, its weight like a weight, weighing him down. He pulled it out, opened it to the same page, and reread it. The words hadn't changed. They still cut like a knife. He remembered the first time Ellie had talked about having a baby. They had been married for only a year, and she had beamed, telling him how she wanted to hear children laughing in their home, how she wanted a family. Raymond had laughed then, saying that they had time, that they were still young. But she had been persistent, and a couple of years later Liam had come. Raymond had never questioned it. Liam was his. He had felt it in every moment the boy had fallen asleep in his arms, in every TCH, in every look of trust. But now he could see the cracks in that picture. Ellie had never spoken about the problems conceiving, never mentioned the doctors, the clinic, James. She had lied to him, and James, his own brother, had helped her do it. Back at the hospital, Raymond sat down in a hard plastic chair in an office that smelled of antiseptic and something metallic. The doctor placed a sheet of paper in front of him, laying it out neatly like evidence. His voice was dry, like old parchment. "Azoospermia," he said, as if announcing the diagnosis to a stranger. "A complete absence of sperm. According to the results, it is congenital. You could never have children." The words hung in the air like frost. The room was quiet, too quiet. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall cut through the hum in his head. Raymond stared at the paper, but the letters floated, turning into abstractions. He didn't hear the doctor continue to talk about genetics, about medical terms, about possible paths, about rare cases. It didn't matter. Liam is not his son. A simple, terrible thought, like a blow, like a straight hook to the solar plexus. He lost his breath, although he sat calmly. Ellie knew. James knew. Everyone except him. Raymond, the ex-boxer, the man who always stood up for the truth, for home, for family was the last to realize he had been living a lie. He remembered Liam, his eyes, his smile, his quiet voice saying Mummy loved Uncle James. It all made sense now. Too clear, too painful. He stood up without waiting for the doctor to finish. He thanked her automatically, as politeness is taught. The paper remained on the table. As he stepped out into the hallway, the hospital walls seemed alien to him, as did everything else. The world hadn't just rocked, it had cracked. And as the cracks grew deeper, Raymond felt something inside him die. At home, Raymond couldn't look at Liam. The boy sat in his room, staring at his tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen as if nothing had changed. Mummy loved Uncle James, he muttered, and Raymond felt the rage flaring up inside him like an old fire. He wanted to grab Liam, to ask him what he knew, what he saw, what he heard, but instead he just stood there, clenching his fists until his nails dug into his palms. He went into the living room, got a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, and poured himself a glass. The liquid burned his throat, but it did nothing to dull the pain. He thought of James, his smile, his lies, the way he had snaked into their lives. And Ellie, how could she? He remembered her eyes, her laugh, her hand in his, and it all seemed fake now, like a cheap suit coming apart at the seams. But there was love in that pain, too, for Liam, for a boy who might not be his by blood, but who was his by heart. Raymond didn't know how to live with it. He didn't know how to look at Liam without seeing Ellie's betrayal. But he knew one thing: James had to answer. He'd disappeared after the funeral, but Raymond would find him. He'd scour every corner of Detroit, every dark alley, every club like the Red Veil where James was rumored to hang out. And if his brother was hiding something about Ellie's death, about Liam, about the lies that had destroyed his world, he'd shake the truth out of him if it was the last thing he did. Raymond picked up the phone and dialed Tommy, his old friend from the bar. "I need to find James," he said when he answered, "and I'm starting with the Red Veil. What do you know?" "Ray, are you crazy?" Tommy's voice was full of panic. "This is no place for your kind. It's a snake pit." "I don't care," Raymond snapped. "Tell me what you know, or I'll find out for myself." Tommy sighed. "Rumor has it James was hanging out there before he went missing. But be careful, Ray. Those people don't like it when people poke their noses into their business." Raymond hung up and looked at the picture on the wall. Ellie, Liam, himself. The family that never was. But Liam was here, and for him, Raymond wouldn't stop. He would find James, and if the truth was worse than he thought, he would burn this town to the ground. Detroit woke to a gloomy sky, its streets crusted with dirty snow, the air smelling of iron and exhaust, as if the city were breathing rust. Raymond Carter sat in his old Ford, parked outside a diner on Cass Avenue, where the coffee was as bitter as his thoughts. Ellie's journal, found the night before, lay on the passenger seat, its tattered cover a scar, a reminder of the betrayal that had torn his world apart. Liam wasn't his son. Ellie knew. James knew. And now Raymond, whose life had been built on a lie, was hell-bent on one thing: finding his brother and shaking the truth out of him, even if it cost him everything. Liam's words, "Mom loved Uncle James," still rang in his head like a broken record, and the confirmation of his congenital sterility from the hospital on Jefferson Avenue only added fuel to the fire. James, his younger brother, had disappeared after Ellie's funeral 6 months ago, leaving behind only the shadows of rumors and questions. Raymond didn't know where to look, but he knew he wouldn't stop. He'd started at the Red Veil, the club coach Mac had mentioned, but had been met with blank stares and evasive answers. The bartender, with a face like old leather, had said James hadn't been seen in 6 months, but rumors of him hung like smoke over the city. Raymond spent the morning knocking on the doors of old acquaintances, the ones who hadn't disappeared or died or skipped town. People he'd once shared a ring with, a drink with, a street conversation with. Now they lived on the side of the road, in abandoned auto repair shops, stores and diners where time stood still along with the neon signs. One of them was Pete, a former bookmaker who now owned a semi-legal garage where they drank beer more than they fixed cars. The air inside was thick with gasoline and cigarette smoke. Pete sat in a broken office chair, leaning over the hood of a rusty Dodge, a cigarette smoldering in the corner of his mouth. When he spotted Raymond, he put down his wrench and sat up wearily. "Old man Ray, it's been so long, I thought you'd vanished completely," he said with a wry smile, exhaling smoke. "It happens," Raymond replied. "I need to know something. About James." Pete raised his eyebrows. "Your brother? Shit. You haven't really been in touch with him since that whole money and car thing." "Not really," Raymond replied shortly. "That's why I'm asking." Pete scratched his head, thoughtful. "Last I heard about him was, maybe 3 months ago. They say he got into some business with some of the guys from the Southern gang, the ones who steal jewelry, masks, clubs, fast cars. Not a movie, but it seems like it." "He worked with them?" Raymond's voice turned cold. "More like they used him. James was always good at one thing, getting into big trouble. I think he wanted to make some money and get out. But the plan went sideways. He was busted almost immediately. Now, I think he's in county jail awaiting trial if he hasn't already been convicted." Raymond clenched his fist, but kept it in his pocket. "Are you sure?" Pete nodded. "That's enough. My cousin works for the department. He said they caught him red-handed with earrings, rings, and someone's wedding bands in his bag." Silence hung between them. Pete flicked his ashes and looked at Raymond more closely. "Why do you need him, Ray? After so many years, you suddenly remembered that he is your brother." Raymond looked away. "We need to close some doors." Pete didn't insist. He just nodded and reached for the hood again. "Well, if you're going to see him, knock on Martin's door on the 3rd floor of the district office. I think he works those shifts. Tell him you're from me." Raymond nodded in response and was about to leave when Pete added, "Hey, Ray, don't expect anything from him. James was a good guy, once, but you know better than anyone some rounds you can't win, even if you want to." Raymond said nothing. He just stepped back into the gray day, where the air was thick with cold and questions. Raymond felt his heart clench. James in jail? That explained why he disappeared after Ellie's funeral, but it didn't explain why Liam was repeating his name like a mantra. He thanked Pete and walked out, his thoughts spinning like the snow outside his window. The county jail was an hour away, in the suburbs where concrete walls and barbed wire were the only scenery. Raymond didn't know what he'd say to James, but he knew he had to see him. He had to hear the truth from his lips, even if it crushed him completely. The drive to the prison was long, the asphalt glistening with wet snow and Raymond's Ford coughing as if it were complaining of the cold. He drove in silence, the radio long since broken, the only sound the scrape of the windshield wipers sweeping snow off the windshield. Ellie's diary was in his jacket pocket, its weight an anchor, pulling him into the abyss. Raymond tried to remember James, not the one who had flashed by at the funeral in a wrinkled suit, but the one he had grown up with, the one he had fought with over the last piece of pie in their mother's kitchen, the one he had trained with at the gym until sweat ran down his eyes. But that James had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by a man Raymond no longer recognized. The man who, according to Ellie's diary, had helped her conceive Liam behind his back. The Milford County Jail loomed over a deserted field, its gray walls like tombstones, its barbed wire glinting in the dim sun. Raymond parked, his hands shaking as he turned off the engine. He passed through security, handed over his keys and wallet, and was led into the visiting room, a cramped space with peeling paint divided by thick glass. The chair was cold as ice, and the air smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Raymond waited, his fingers drumming on the table, until the door on the other side opened. James walked into the visiting room, followed by a guard. His orange robe hung on him like a hanger, shapeless, like a stranger's clothes. He had lost a lot of weight, his chin had become pointed, his neck thin like a teenager's, but his movements were still lazy, almost mocking, like a man who didn't care. His face was pale, almost gray, with an earthy tint, like a man who had not seen the sun for a long time. There were deep shadows under his eyes, bruises from sleepless nights or thoughts that did not give him peace. But his gaze was still bold, defiant. And the same old, insolent smile, a crooked curve of the lips, not quite all the way, as if he was still playing a joke on someone flickered at the corners of his mouth. This smile always drove Raymond crazy. James sat down slowly across from him, leaning back like an actor on the hard plastic chair, picked up the phone with the holder, and finally looked up at his brother. He looked through the glass as if they were meeting not in a prison cell, but in a bar on the corner like in the old, painfully familiar times, where you could still pretend that everything was under control. He tilted his head to the side, feigning surprise. Well, well, the great and powerful Ray. Did something happen, or did he just miss my charisma? Raymond picked up the phone slowly, his eyes never leaving his face. His jaw was clenched, his gaze heavy as lead. And in this silence, where even the creak of plastic sounded loud, the tension was growing, as if this was not a conversation but a bare-knuckle fight, the first round of which was about to begin. Raymond gripped the pipe so tightly that the plastic creaked under his fingers. His knuckles were white, and there was a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. Through the thick glass, smelling of sweat and sterility, he looked into the eyes of the man who had once been his brother. "Don't start, James," he said in a low, hoarse voice, more like the growl of an animal than human speech. "I found Ellie's diary." James's smile faltered. It was barely noticeable, like a crack in a mask, but Raymond caught it. He caught it because he was waiting, because he was looking for any sign of truth. James quickly pulled his expression back into indifference, as if nothing had happened, as if he were an actor who had rehearsed this scene many times. "Diary?" he snorted, tilting his head slightly to the side. "What's in there? Shopping lists? Pie recipes?" "Don't play dumb." Raymond leaned closer to the glass, his eyes glowing like coals in an old stove. "You know what I mean, Liam. You helped Ellie. You." He hesitated, as if he himself did not believe what he was about to say. "You are Liam's father." There was silence. Thick, viscous, heavier than the concrete Raymond had hauled around construction sites after his boxing career ended. James looked away. His fingers began to tap nervously on the table, fast, choppy, like a heart in panic. His brother's mask had cracked. "Really? You don't understand, Ray." He finally squeezed out. His voice became quieter, trembling slightly. "It's not what you think." "Then explain," Raymond barked, but held back, lowering his voice. "Explain why my wife paid you to have a baby behind my back. Explain why Liam is your son and not mine. Explain why you stood at her funeral, looked me in the eye, and said nothing." James opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something and then closed it. Only then, looking down and seeming to chew on his words, did he speak. "I didn't want this. Ellie was desperate. She wanted a baby Ray. She loved you. A lot. But she knew." He swallowed. "She knew you couldn't have kids. She was told before the wedding. She didn't want to hurt you. She didn't want you to feel less broken." Raymond froze. All the sounds, the hum of the ventilation, someone's footsteps, the noise from the other side of the glass disappeared. Only this remained, before the wedding she knew, and he didn't. "She knew, before the wedding?" he exhaled. His voice was hoarse, as if someone was tearing his vocal cords from the inside. "And you agreed, you became the father of my son." "No," James looked up sharply. "That's not true. I didn't sleep with her, if that's what you mean. It was a clinic. It's all official. I just helped. I found a place, made arrangements. She paid. I just—" He closed his eyes for a second, as if he wanted to stop an avalanche. "She begged, Ray, said it was the only way to save your marriage. You were her meaning. She just wanted you to be happy, to have a chance to be a father." Raymond listened, but his head was buzzing. Everything he knew, everything he believed in, was crumbling right now, stone by stone. "You knew all along," he whispered, trembling with tension. "You stood at her funeral, James. You stood next to me, with tears in your eyes. and you were silent, and then you just disappeared." "I didn't disappear." James slammed his fist on the table, causing it to shake. "I was in trouble. A robbery gone wrong. I got caught. Yeah, I was a coward, okay? I couldn't look you in the eye. I couldn't tell you that everything you thought was yours started with a lie. I thought, if you never knew, it would be easier. For everyone." "Easier," Raymond chuckled, but there was no humor in it. The laughter was bitter, like old medicine. "My life is fiction. I raised a child thinking he was my blood. My wife lied to me every day. And you, my brother, were part of this conspiracy. How could it be any easier?" James froze. His shoulders slumped. His eyes grew dull, like a man who had lost everything. "I'm not a hero, Ray. I never was. But I swear, I didn't mean to hurt you. Ellie, she didn't do this to trick you. She did this for you. For the family you've always dreamed of." Raymond leaned back heavily in his chair. His hands shook. The receiver slipped and hung by its cord. He looked at James, but there was no brother there anymore. Only a ghost. A shadow of the one who had stolen from him not just the truth, but the meaning. "Why is Liam talking about you?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "He keeps saying, 'Mama loved Uncle James.' What does he know?" James hesitated. Then he said, barely audible, "I don't know. He was just a baby. Ellie would bring him to the clinic sometimes. We saw each other a few times. I tried to be an uncle. Talk. Nothing more. But maybe he heard her talking about me. Thank you. She used to say, James gave me a family. Maybe he remembered that." The words hit harder than any punch in the ring. Raymond stood up slowly, his chair scraping across the floor like a death rattle. "You didn't give her a family," he said evenly, looking into the eyes. "You stole mine, you and her, and I will never forgive you for it." He didn't wait for an answer. He hung up the phone without waiting for an answer and walked out without looking back. The security guard escorted him to the exit, but Raymond barely noticed his surroundings. His mind was full of images: Ellie hiding the truth, James standing at the funeral with a guilty look, Liam repeating words he couldn't understand. The world he knew had collapsed, and now Raymond stood in its rubble, unsure of how to move forward. On the way back to Detroit, the snow grew heavier, covering the road as if trying to erase the traces of his pain. Raymond stopped at a gas station, his hands shaking as he poured coffee from the machine. He thought of Liam, the boy who was his son despite the truth he had learned. He thought of Ellie, her love that now seemed poisoned by lies, and of James, whose confession had been a knife in his heart. He came home late. Liam was asleep, his tablet lying next to him, glowing in the darkness. Raymond stood in the doorway, looking at his son, feeling the love and pain warring within him. Liam was not his by blood, but he was his by heart. And for him, Raymond had to find a way to move on. But first, he had to understand what else the past held. James had mentioned the clinic, the people he had made arrangements with. Raymond knew it wasn't over. The red veil still loomed on the horizon, a dark spot, and he sensed something else. Was there maybe answers about Ellie's death, maybe more lies? He sank down onto the sofa, heavily, noisily, as if the strength had begun to leave his body. He took off his jacket and threw it on the armrest, but the cold seemed to remain inside, lurking under his skin. The room was quiet, too quiet. Only the faint hum of the heating and the rustle of the wind outside the window. Somewhere in the other room, a clock was ticking softly, but Raymond did not hear it. All his attention was focused on the diary. He took it out of the drawer, a battered black notebook with a soft cover, showing the signs of time. Ellie had once kept it by her bed, writing in it in a small, neat hand, as if she were afraid to disturb the silence of her thoughts. He ran his fingers over the pages. They were cold and rough, like someone else's memories. He leafed through them quickly, almost mechanically, until his gaze caught a line written in the middle of the page, diagonally, with slightly trembling letters. "J. said the clinic is connected to the Red Veil people. They charge a lot, but it's safe." Raymond Zamer. The Red Veil. He'd heard the name before. Once, briefly, when he'd spoken to Pete. Once, when he'd checked into James's background. Back then, it had sounded distant, vague, perhaps just a name. Now it was in his home, in his life. In Ellie's dairy, it wasn't a coincidence. He slowly laid the diary on his lap, his heart pounding dully, ringing in his temples like an alarm. James had gotten himself into a robbery, yes, but before the prison, before the trials, before the escape, he was connected to these people, to the Red Veil, and Ellie too, perhaps, not as a victim, but as a participant, a witness. Who were they? And why did their shadow still hover over everything he once considered his life? He looked up. The snow outside the window was falling slowly, almost lazily. White flakes settled on the glass, disappearing, melting like memories. But to him, it wasn't snow. It was ashes. He felt something burning away faith, hope, old images of Ellie. Every bit of truth now smelled of burning. Raymond closed the diary and put it on the table. He stood up. He went to the window, hugging himself. The reflection in the glass looked at him with a tired, unfamiliar face, pale, with alien eyes. But inside there was a burning, no longer anger, no longer despair. Something else. Purposeful, pure as steel. He will find these people. The Red Veil. He'll find out who they are, what they've done, and if there's a lie behind all this, if they're involved in Ellie's death, in his son not knowing the truth, in ruining his life, he'll raise the whole city. He'll turn every street, every basement, every clinic, every shadow. He will tear this city to pieces to get to the bottom of it, to the dirtiest, naked truth. He was no longer a guard, no longer a father, no longer a widower. He was a man who had everything taken from him, which meant that now he had nothing to lose. Detroit was engulfed in twilight, its streets covered in dirty snow that crunched underfoot like the bones of an old city. Raymond Carter sat on the edge of the couch in his cramped apartment, clutching an empty glass that still smelled of whiskey. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, but inside it was colder, a cold that came from deep within him, where the truth revealed in the prison visiting room was eating away at everything he knew about himself. James, his younger brother, was Liam's biological father. Ellie, the woman he loved, had lied to him. Liam, his son, was not his by blood. These thoughts swirled through Raymond's head like crows over carrion, each one bringing a new wave of rage and pain and confusion. He stared at the picture on the wall Ellie, Liam, himself, captured in a moment that now seemed fake. His fingers tightened around the glass until it cracked, leaving a thin line like a scar. Raymond wanted to kill James. He imagined his fists smashing into his brother's face, him falling, his insolent smile disappearing in a flood of blood. The fantasy was so vivid he could almost taste the iron in his mouth. James had stolen his family, his truth, his life. But then Raymond heard the soft t-t-t-t-t from Liam's room, and the rage receded, replaced by something heavier, love mixed with desperation. It wasn't Liam's fault. This boy, with his tablet and his timid eyes, was all Raymond had left. And Raymond was the only one who could give him a home, stability, care. He stood up, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of Detroit on his shoulders. He walked to Liam's room, the door ajar, the dim light from his tablet casting shadows on the walls. Liam was asleep, curled under the covers, his face calm, almost weightless. Raymond looked at him, and his heart clenched. Liam wasn't his by blood, but every moment he held him, every time the boy fell asleep, trustingly pressed against him, had been real. James might have been the donor, but he wasn't a father. A father is someone who stays, someone who fights, someone who loves no matter what. And yet the truth burned like acid. How to live with it. How to look at Liam without seeing Ellie's betrayal. How not to hate James, knowing that he was a part of this boy. Raymond walked back into the living room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't a calm silence, it was oppressive, like the dead ceiling of a bomb shelter. The shadows from the lamp seemed longer than usual, as if they were stretching with his thoughts. His gaze fell on Ellie's dairy, still lying on the table, slightly open, like a wound that wouldn't heal. He didn't want to touch it. Too much had been said, too much had been heard. But his hands reached for the cover, his fingers gliding over the worn edges like scars that wouldn't heal. He opened the journal again. The pages were crackling with time and pain. His gaze ran over the familiar lines, Ellie's words, her thoughts, her fears, her hopes, hidden in the ink. But now he wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for justification. He wanted to cling to something that would allow him to forgive, to understand, to justify the woman he still loved, despite everything. And then he came across a recording that he had simply missed in his rage. "I'm afraid Ray won't forgive me, but I can't lose him. Liam is our bridge. He will connect us, even if the truth tears everything apart." He froze. His heart skipped a beat. Our bridge. Raymond closed the diary, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't read anymore. His fingers were shaking, not from the cold, but from how much he wanted things to be different. Ellie wasn't betraying him, she was protecting him, in her own way, broken, with no room for error. She was wrong. The truth didn't just tear their family apart, it destroyed her, burned to ashes, leaving Raymond standing alone in the ruins. He poured himself another whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing into the glass with a soft splash, like blood from an old wound. He didn't drink. He just sat there, watching it tremble, reflecting the dim light of the lamp and the shifting shadows on the ceiling. The whiskey was a mirror, a small, shaky reflection of his broken world. Thoughts were rushing around in my head like angry dogs. In one room, rage, cold, clear, almost sweet in its thirst for revenge. He saw himself driving back to Milford Prison, walking past the guards, sitting down across from James and not picking up the phone. Just standing up. Just hits. He beats until the bones start to crunch, until the brother's mask flies off forever, until he sees fear, real animal fear, until the last blow, until silence, until death. The thought was so tempting, sweet, like a sip of poison with a taste of justice. But then he saw Liam, a thin, vulnerable boy sitting on the corner of the couch, his head glued to his tablet. His lips move, a quiet ttt barely audible. His eyes are full of trust. He reaches out to Raymond when he's afraid. He smiles, albeit rarely, when he feels safe. He believes that next to him is his father. What if Raymond comes back from prison, or from the morgue? Who will be with Liam then? Who will hold his hand when he gets lost in his world again? He has no right to leave. Not now. Not out of anger, no matter how righteous. To kill James is to kill yourself. And Liam needs his father. Alive. Strong. Reliable. Not a ghost, not an avenger, not a broken man with empty eyes. Athat, who can hold his hand even when the rest of the world is falling apart. Raymond set the glass down on the table without touching the whiskey. He looked at the diary, and then at the old photograph of Ellie standing by the lamp, her face clear, bright, and smiling. He didn't know if he'd ever forgive her, or James, or himself. But he knew that tomorrow he would get up. He will stand up for Liam. He will get up and will find the red veil, not for revenge, not for the sake of truth, but to understand who he is dealing with now, to protect son, to complete the circle, even if it means burning the entire city to the ground. Raymond walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Detroit. The city was a mirror to his soul, cold, broken, but still alive. He thought about what James had said in prison. Ellie wanted Liam to be yours. Those words were both a knife and a lifeline. Ellie loved him, even if her love was laced with lies. And Liam, despite everything, was his son. Not by blood, but by choice. But how to accept that? How to live knowing that every time he looked at Liam, he would be reminded of Ellie's betrayal. He closed his eyes, and the memory flashed like a glint of sunlight through dark clouds. Sharp, vivid, almost painful. Maternity hospital. White walls, the smell of antiseptic, everything in a half-tone and tense anticipation. Ellie lay on the bed, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but her smile was so bright it could light up the whole world. She held tiny Liam in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket like a cocoon, and when Raymond came closer, she handed him her son, carefully, like something precious, infinitely fragile. "He is ours," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but there was faith in her eyes. Faith in them, in the future, in this new life they had just brought into the world. And he believed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for cracks at the moment. Liam was in his arms, his skin warm, his heart beating fast and steady like a drum in his chest. And that was enough. He felt like a father, a husband, whole. Now years later, after everything he knew that Ellie had been hiding the truth even then, that behind her shining smile lay the weight of decisions, the fear, the secret he had never even guessed at. But no matter what she did, her love was real. To him, to Liam, to their fragile, fictional, but real beloved family. This knowledge was the thin thread he hung on to, the only thing that kept him from falling into the abyss. He couldn't hate Ellie. He couldn't, despite the lies. She had done what she had done out of love. He felt it. He understood it. And he forgave. He couldn't hate Liam either, because is his son. Not by blood, but by everything else. By endless, sleepless nights. By warm fingers clinging to a shirt. By a look that held the whole world. By childhood fears that Raymond drowned out with quiet songs and confident embraces. By every word, gesture, breath. But James was a different story. Raymond sank slowly onto the couch, his shoulders slumping. He closed his eyes and saw his brother standing before him, the same one who always laughed first, but disappeared when the going got tough. The smile, smug, brazen, familiar. He wanted to rip it off his face. He wanted James suffered so that he would feel the same pain, the same treacherous emptiness, the same rage that now lived in him, in Raymond. He clenched his fists. The knuckles turned white. He wanted no, he longed to cause pain, even if he had to pay for it, even if he had to disappear himself. But he saw before him Liam, a boy who had already lost his mother, a boy who, despite everything, still looked at him with trust, with love. Liam was fragile not because of autism, no. He was fragile because all he had to live on was be one person, Raymond. If he gives vent to his rage, if he steps into the place where vengeance reigns, what will happen to Liam? Who will protect him when the night comes? Who will explain to him why Daddy won't come back? Nobody. He was the last, the only one. Not by blood, by choice. Being a father was harder than any fight in the ring. Harder than working the night shift in a warehouse. Harder than living with a lie in your chest. It wasn't a fight with someone, it was a battle with oneself. Every day, every night. Raymond leaned back, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. No, he wouldn't forget, and he wouldn't forgive. But he won't let revenge destroy Liam because now all he has Ish. And for his sake, he will stand firm. Even if he himself has long since burst at the seams. Every day we open our eyes to what some are trying to hide. We get the truth out of the dark for you. For everyone who wants to know and not believe fairy tales. A like is your sign that the truth is important to you, and the subscription is your promise to be with us until the end. He stood up and walked into the kitchen, where a pack of cigarettes he hadn't touched in a year lay on the table. He pulled one out, lit a match, and took a drag, feeling the smoke burn his lungs. It didn't help, but it gave him a moment of respite, as if he could exhale his pain along with the smoke. He thought about what to do next. The red veil still loomed on the horizon, a dark spot connected to the clinic, to James, to Ellie. Raymond sensed that there was more there, maybe answers about Ellie's death, maybe more lies. But now he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The truth had already destroyed him. How much more could he take? He went back into the living room and picked up the phone. Tommy, his old friend from the hole, was the only one he could trust. "Tom," Raymond said when he answered, his voice rough with smoke and fatigue. "I want more about the Red Veil. What's going on there? Who's running it?" "Ray, are you serious?" Tommy's voice was full of worry. "I told you, it's a shithole. People you don't want to mess with hang out there. It's gotten even worse since James got busted. There are rumors of some boss who's got it all under his thumb, but I don't know any names, and I don't recommend you dig." "I don't care," Raymond snapped. "I have to for Liam." Tommy sighed. "Okay," he said, "I'll ask around. But Ray, think of the boy. If you get into trouble, who's going to take care of him?" Raymond hung up the phone, his gaze falling on the picture of Liam on the shelf. The boy was smiling, holding the stuffed lion Raymond had won at the fair. This moment was real, and for moments like these, Raymond had to keep going. But his inner struggle continued. He wanted revenge, he wanted the truth. But he knew that each new secret could drag him deeper into the abyss, where he would lose not only himself, but Liam as well. He walked into Liam's room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked down at his sleeping son. "T," Liam muttered in his sleep, and Raymond felt tears sting his eyes. He hadn't cried since Alina's funeral. He had cried not only because of the betrayal, but because of the love that still lived inside him despite everything. He carefully adjusted the blanket, his hand shaking. "I will not leave you, champion," he whispered. "Never." He talked to himself, but he knew the fight wasn't over. His rage toward James was like a dark river, flowing beneath the surface. He could suppress it for Liam, but he couldn't drown it out. And the red veil was calling to him like a siren, promising answers that could either heal him or destroy him. Raymond walked back into the living room, his eyes falling on Ellie's journal. He knew he should leave it behind, but he couldn't. One line he'd noticed last time still burned in his mind. "The clinic is connected to the Red Veil people. They're dangerous, but James says it's under control." Raymond clenched his fists. James was lying. Nothing was under control. And if these people had anything to do with Ellie's death, her secret, Liam, Raymond would find them. But he knew now that he had to be careful. Not for himself, but for the boy sleeping in the next room. His internal struggle was far from over, but Liam was his anchor, his reason. And even though the truth was unbearable, he would bear it like a cross, for the son he had chosen. Detroit was shrouded in a blanket of night fog, its streets glistening with moisture like black glass, its streetlights casting long, trembling shadows, as if the city were hiding its sins in the darkness. Raymond Carter sat at the rickety table in his kitchen, a piece of paper in front of him, covered in neat but shaky handwriting. It was an application for parole for James, his younger brother, the man whose confession in Milford State Penitentiary had torn his life apart. James was the biological father of Liam, the boy Raymond had thought of as his son until Ellie's journal and the medical truth had shattered that illusion. Now, in a silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, Raymond made a choice that went against his every instinct. He wanted to get James out of prison, but not for his brother, for Liam. Raymond gripped his pen, his knuckles white. His mind was a battlefield, rage and duty clashing like two beasts tearing each other apart. Ever since meeting James in prison, confessing to being Ellie's donor, Raymond hadn't been able to shake the urge to destroy him. He imagined his fists crushing into his brother's face, him collapsing, his blood mixing with the cold concrete. But then he thought of Liam, of his timid t, of the way the boy looked at him, trusting him despite the chaos that surrounded their lives. Liam wasn't to blame for Ellie's betrayal, for James's lies, for the pain that burned inside Raymond. And Liam deserved better than a broken father hell-bent on revenge. He deserved a family, however imperfect, built on rubble. Raymond put his pen down and looked at the photograph on the wall. Ellie, Liam, himself, captured in a moment that now seemed like a distant dream. He remembered Ellie's words from her diary. "Liam is our bridge." She had wanted the boy to connect them, even if the truth would tear them apart. And now Raymond knew that that bridge had to include James not as a father, but as an uncle, a shadow in the background who wouldn't destroy Liam's fragile world. James was a part of the boy, and Raymond couldn't erase that, no matter how much he wanted to. But he could set the rules. If James came out, he would not claim paternity. He would be the uncle he had always been, and nothing more. It was the only way to protect Liam, to give him the stability he needed. Here's an expanded, emotionally rich version of the scene, emphasizing Raymond's internal struggle, determination, and sacrifice. Raymond stood up. His movements were slow, as if every effort reverberated in his joints, his back, his heart. His steps echoed hollowly on the floor, heavy, as if he were dragging the entire city behind him. Detroit, concrete, tired, broken, like himself. He went to the window and stared out at the street, where the flickering light of the street lamp was turning the snow into a gray, sticky slush. Snow and mud merged into a mess, like what was going on in his head. He remembered everything. How he reached for Ellie's diary with hope and found scars in it. How he read the word azoospermia and felt that someone had torn away not only his future, but also his past. How he entered the prison room and saw James not his brother, but a traitor in an orange robe. How every conversation became a massacre where there were no winners. Every truth revealed in these weeks hit him like a series of punches to the ribs. No time to recover. No chance to block. But Liam was what kept him going. The boy with eyes full of trust, even when Raymond himself felt empty. Liam wasn't just a meaning. He was the point of being better. And now, for his sake, for the sake of the one constant in this broken equation, Raymond had to do something impossible: get James out of jail. He returned to the table. There was the statement on it, neatly folded, typed, but each line of it was a bullet through his pride. He read it again, absorbed the words as if he wanted to find something in them that didn't feel like a betrayal of himself. I, Raymond T. Miller, do hereby declare that James Miller is my brother. I will stand surety for his appearance in court. Simple words, but each one was a nail in the coffin of his principles. He didn't believe in James. He didn't believe in his repentance. But he did believe that if he doesn't do this, Liam will learn the truth in the worst possible way, through the words of others, through whispers on the street, through documents that will one day fall into his hands, and then everything he has built will collapse. Finally, he added one last point, not in print by hand, clearly, without hesitation. Upon release, James Miller agrees not to publicly or privately assert his biological paternity of Liam Miller. Any breach of this clause will automatically void my surety. It was not just a condition. It was an ultimatum. The line, the last frontier. And if James crosses it, he'll find out Raymond still has fists. Not for revenge, for defense. He put the pen down and exhaled. His heart didn't feel any lighter. On the contrary, the burden became heavier. But that was the price he had to pay, consciously was ready to pay. Because being a father means doing what is right, even if it tears you apart from the inside. The next morning, Raymond drove Liam to Mrs. Glover, the neighbor who was babysitting the boy. Liam was sitting on her couch, his head glued to his tablet, his fingers tapping rhythmically across the screen. "T," he muttered without looking up, and Raymond felt his heart tighten. He wanted to hug his son, to tell him everything would be okay, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded at Mrs. Glover and walked out, the weight of his decision weighing on his shoulders. Lester's office was on the second floor of an old brick building between an insurance office and a used phone store. On the glass door was a worn sign with faded writing. Lester Wall's law practice inside. It smelled of old papers, coffee, and a barely noticeable note of disappointment that had settled in the walls over years of lost cases and compromises. Lester was a thin man with sagging skin on his cheeks and eyes frozen from sleepless nights. His suit was a little big in the shoulders and had long since lost its shape, but his movements were precise. Confident, he seemed to know what he was doing and had long since stopped worrying about how he looked. He took the application from Raymond's hands and ran his eyes over the pages with a businesslike detachment, as if he were reading a tax form rather than the fate of two brothers bound by the same tragedy. "Your brother's case is not simple," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Armed robbery is serious business. Judges don't like to take risks, but—" He paused, turned the page, and tapped his fingernail on the signature field. "His behavior is clean. No conflicts, no violations of the regime. If you are ready to vouch for him, and if he agrees to the conditions, there is a chance. Parole is possible. The main thing is for the court to see that he has support, family support." Raymond chuckled, briefly, bitterly, joylessly, as if he had heard a bad joke. Family support, He repeated slowly, as if he was tasting the words. I'm not doing this for him. I'm doing this for my son. Lester looked up. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding, professional and human. He had seen people like Raymond dozens of times, people who had been bent by circumstances but not broken, people who came not for justice, but for the opportunity to hold on to what was left of their world. Understand, he said quietly, I'll prepare the papers, but there's a catch. You'll need to meet with James. He'll need to agree to the terms in person, especially the one about limiting contact with your son. The court needs to see that this is a mutual agreement, a voluntary one. Raymond nodded silently. Beneath the table, his fists were clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He could already feel the old rage humming in his chest, the same rage that rose up every time he thought of James, of his smile, of his betrayal. Meeting his brother again would be like walking barefoot over broken glass one step at a time, knowing that each step would bring blood. But he was ready. For Liam, in order to protect at least one thing that could still be saved. He picked up a pen and signed the papers. Each letter was like a pain in his fingers. He left Lester in advance, nodded briefly in farewell, and left the office without saying a word. Outside, the cold Detroit air hit him in the face like a slap. It got under his collar, into his lungs, into his chest, all the way to his heart. He stood on the sidewalk, looking out at the street where the gray cars crawled past like ghosts. The snow was falling, no longer like it had in his childhood, white and joyful, but like a blanket the city used to cover everything dead. It wasn't winter. It was a countdown. He knew that there was no relief ahead, but another battle. Only now not with fists, but with words, control, silence. And he was ready. The drive to the Milford County Jail was familiar, but it seemed longer now, as if every mile was a challenge. Snow was falling in small flakes, coating the asphalt in a thin layer, and Raymond's Ford creaked like an old fighter going into his last fight. He thought about what he would say to James. The words swirled around in his head, but none of them felt right. He wanted to scream, to hit, to demand that James disappear from their lives forever. But he knew that was impossible. James was a part of Liam, and Raymond had to find a way to live with that, even if every time he looked at his brother, it was like a knife in his heart. The prison greeted him with the same gray gloom as the last time. Concrete walls, barbed wire, the smell of disinfectant, it was all like the scenery of his own personal hell. Raymond walked through the guards, his steps heavy, as if he were walking to the scaffold. The visiting room was just as he remembered, peeling paint, a cold chair, thick glass separating him from his brother. He sat down, his fingers drumming on the table until the door on the other side opened. James walked in, followed by a guard. His steps were sluggish, like a man tired of fighting even gravity. His orange prison uniform was wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it for several nights in a row, and he probably had. His cheeks were sunken, his lips chapped. He looked older, more haggard, but his eyes still held that same strange mixture guilt he couldn't hide and an insolence he couldn't let go. He sat down opposite her, picked up the receiver, and put it to his ear. But before he could even exhale, Raymond's voice cut through the space between them, hoarse and low, like the rumble of distant thunder. I have applied for your parole. James froze. He didn't blink, didn't move, only his fingers tightened on the phone. What are you doing? I'm not finished, Raymond interrupted. His eyes were like a trap, tenacious, heavy, not giving James the slightest chance to look away. I have a condition. Just one. You are not Liam's father. You never were, and you never will be. You are an uncle. Only an uncle. If you ever try to tell him the truth, even hint at it, I will find you. And I swear to God, you will wish you had never left that cell. Pause. A long one. James looked at his brother, his face motionless, like a mask from an old play, with a frozen expression that could be read in any number of ways. Indifference, contempt, fear. Are you serious? He finally squeezed out, his voice hoarse, but without the usual mockery. After everything you want to pull me out? Not for Yorman snapped. His voice was dry, almost cruel. For Liam, he deserves a family, even if it's cracked like a damn mirror. But you're not part of it. You're a shadow, James, an echo of a mistake. And if you come one step closer to the line I've drawn, I'll make you disappear. Understand me? James swallowed. His fingers began to fiddle with the coiled cord of the receiver as if searching for an answer. His gaze fell to the table and his voice grew quieter. I don't want to be his father, Ray. Honestly, I never did. Ellie. She was so persuasive. She said it was the only way. I thought I'd help him and then disappear. That's what would have happened if she had. He fell silent, pursing his lips. If she hadn't died, Raymond finished for him. If only you hadn't gotten yourself into trouble like you always do. Yes, James agreed quietly. I'm not a hero. I don't even know who I am anymore. But I'm definitely not the one who should ruin your life. Or his. He's a good boy. Even when I saw him, he was. Special. I would only do harm. Raymond was silent. For a few seconds he just stared, trying to figure out if his brother was lying, or if he was finally telling the truth. And for the first time in a long time, there was more than just contempt in his gaze. There was something else there, fatigue, maybe, or the realization that it wasn't an enemy sitting in front of him. Not quite. Do you agree? He asked finally, his voice like ice calm, but deathly cold. You're an uncle. Nothing more. You live as I say. You keep your mouth shut. Forever. Got it. James nodded, hesitantly, then more firmly. His eyes dimmed as if he had left something important in the room with that nod. A remnant of pride, of personality, of who he had wanted to be but had never become. Agree, he said. I won't tell him. Never. I swear. This is not an oath, Raymond said sharply. This is a sentence. If you break it, there will be no second chance. They sat opposite each other, and silence fell between them again. Only this time it was not hostile, but almost mournful, like between two survivors of the same catastrophe who know there is no way back. Raymond slowly lowered the receiver, not looking away. Then he stood up. Take care of your freedom, James. It's the only thing you have left. Raymond felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, but the pain remained. He wanted to say more, to curse James, to forgive him, to ask why things had gone this way, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he hung up, the movement as sharp as a blow. James looked at him through the glass, his face a mix of guilt, weariness, and something Raymond couldn't quite make out. They sat in silence, separated by the glass, but connected by blood and lies and the boy they shared. Raymond stood, his chair scraping against the linoleum. He looked at James one last time, his eyes full of unspoken words. It was a farewell not to the brother he once knew, but to the ghost who had ruined his life. James raised his hand as if to touch the glass, but stopped. His fingers hovered in midair, then slowly lowered. Raymond turned and walked away without looking back. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, like a coffin lid. On the way back to Detroit, the snow grew heavier, silting up the road as if the city was trying to bury his pain. Raymond stopped at a gas station, his hands shaking as he poured coffee from the machine. He felt empty, as if he'd given up part of himself in that visiting room. But there was something new in that emptying, not peace, but determination. He'd made a choice for Liam, and it was the first step toward building a world for his son where the truth wouldn't destroy him. When he got home, he found Liam on the couch, still holding his tablet. The boy looked up at him, his eyes clear but distant. "TTT," he murmured, and Raymond smiled for the first time in a long time. He sat down next to him, his hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll get through this, champ," he said quietly. "You and me. Always." But even with those words, he knew the story wasn't over. The red veil was still waiting for him, a dark shadow connected to the clinic, to Ellie, to James. Raymond sensed something else. Was there maybe answers about Ellie's death, maybe more pain. But he was ready to face it now, not for revenge, but for duty. Liam was his son, no matter what, and Raymond would protect him, even if it cost him his life. Detroit was a city that ate its people, its streets a mouth full of rusty teeth, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and despair. Raymond Carter stood at the window of his apartment, looking out at the murky horizon, where the city lights shimmered like stars dying in a cold night. His hands were still warm from the parole application he had filed for James for Liam, but his heart was as cold as the concrete beneath his feet. The last few weeks had torn his life apart. Ellie's journal, her lies about Liam, James's confession in prison, the medical truth about his infertility. And now, in the silence broken only by the creak of the radiator, Raymond realized that all along he had been the perfect target for the deception, for the pain, for the decisions of others who had built his life like a house of sand, ready to crumble at the slightest breeze. But Liam, his son, was, despite everything, the reason he had to become something more a shield that would protect the boy from the same world that had destroyed him. Raymond walked away from the window, his steps heavy, as if he carried the weight of his mistakes on his shoulders. He sat down on the sofa, his gaze falling on Ellie's battered box, still lying on the floor from the night he'd found her diary. The diary had been a grenade that had blown up his world, but now he saw it not only as a betrayal, but as a map of how he had become a target. Ellie had known about his infertility before they were married, but she had chosen to remain silent, thinking that the lie would protect him. James, his own brother, had agreed to be Liam's donor, but had kept it a secret, thinking the truth too hard to bear. Even Liam, an innocent child, had become part of this web, his words, "Mummy loved Uncle James," an echo that had unwittingly revealed the truth. Raymond was the man everyone pitied, the man everyone had deceived, because he was too trusting, too loyal, too blind. He picked up the journal, his fingers sliding over the worn leather, but he didn't open it. He no longer looked for answers in her words, he looked for them in himself. Why hadn't he seen the cracks? Why hadn't he asked questions when Ellie spoke so insistently of the baby? Why hadn't he seen James avoid his gaze at family dinners? Raymond realized that his love for Ellie, his belief in his family, his desire to be a good husband and father had made him vulnerable. He was the perfect target because he'd never doubted, never dug deeper, never considered that the people he loved could lie. And now he was paying for it not just in his own pain, but in the fear that Liam would become a target too if he didn't change. Raymond stood, his gaze falling on the picture of Liam on the shelf, the boy smiling and holding the stuffed lion Raymond had won at the fair. This moment was real, and so was the love that bound them together. Liam was not his by blood, but he was his by heart, and Raymond knew he had to protect him from a world that was beginning to show its claws. He remembered Liam murmuring "T-T-T-T" in his sleep, his eyes searching for his father even when he couldn't put it into words. This boy was all Raymond had left, and for him, he had to be not a victim, but a shield, someone who wouldn't let the lies or the pain or the decisions of others ruin their lives. But that shield couldn't be built out of love alone. Raymond knew that the Red Veil, the club mentioned in Ellie's diary, was still waiting for him, a dark web connected to the clinic where Liam was conceived and to the people who might know more about Ellie's death. He sensed something else was there, not just answers, but a threat that could hang over Liam if he didn't sort it out. His decision to apply for James's release was the first step, but it wouldn't be the last. James had agreed to be nothing more than an uncle, but Raymond couldn't trust him completely. And if the Red Veil was part of this story, he had to know the truth, even if it was even more unbearable. The whole bar was still the same. Dim lighting, smoky air, and old wooden chairs that creaked with the slightest movement. Raymond opened the door and felt the warmth of the bar push into his chest, as if to say, "You're here again." Tommy stood behind the counter. Old leather jacket, worn apron, same rag in hand, as if time had not moved here. Well, Tommy grinned, not stopping. "Mr. Insomnia himself. What can't you sleep, Ray?" "The weather," Raymond replied, coming closer. "And thoughts." "A dangerous combination," Tommy muttered, pouring the whiskey without asking any questions. "On the house, or for old wounds." Ray took the glass and looked at the amber liquid. "Do you still understand people like bottles? Only in those that cracked but didn't fall apart," Tommy smiled. And what about you? Still pulling. I'm dragging him. Raymond nodded. The boy has grown up, but he barely speaks. A few seconds of silence. Just the hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the crunch of ice in someone's glass in the far corner. Remember how we started a fight here? Raymond asked, smiling slightly. The one where you broke Johnny's nose and I hit him on the back of the head with a bottle? No, the other one, where they carried us out like trash. After billiards. Oh, that? Yeah, we got it pretty good that time. Tommy grinned. But you took the hit so well that the waitress gave you her number. And she took it immediately when she found out that I had a child. Classic, Tommy chuckled, reaching for another bottle. Time spares no one, brother. Not us, not those girls, not the city. Everything gets old, everything rusts. But the bar is standing, because idiots like you still come here and don't ask what it's made of. Ray laughed quietly for the first time in a long time. Okay, I'll go. I just came to say that I'm alive, and to hear that you're still the same. Well, I'm not changing, Ray. Someone has to remain the anchor. Take care of yourself, old man. And you a boy. That's the main thing. Raymond nodded, finished his whiskey, and left. The bar was back to its hum, as if he had never been there. Only the empty glass remained on the counter, like a trace. The house was as quiet as a church. Raymond threw his jacket over the back of a chair and headed into Liam's room. The light from under the door was warm, soft. He opened the door to find his son on the bed, his legs tucked up, his head glued to his tablet. The screen was flickering, colors flashing in a rhythm that Liam was repeating under his breath. T, the boy muttered. His lips barely moved, but his gaze was focused. Are you okay, champ? Raymond asked, dropping down next to him. His hand landed on his shoulder, gently, without pressure. Liam nodded, not taking his eyes off the screen. Raymond didn't say more. He just sat with him, feeling the living warmth beneath his hand. Imperfect, fragile, but real. Despite everything he'd learned, despite the fact that Liam's blood wasn't his, he was his son. And no one could take that away. A few minutes later, Raymond stood up and walked into the living room. The room greeted him with silence and a box on the table, the same one with Ellie's things. He sat down without opening it, just looking at it, like a mine in which something personal was still ticking. He remembered Ellie laughing once, laughing until she cried, wiping her eyes, while he was trying to carve an apple for Liam. There was something in that laugh he hadn't heard in a long time. Lightness. The kind of lightness he only felt in his sleep now, if he felt it at all. His hand instinctively reached for the photograph him, Ellie, and Liam on the beach in summer. All three of them squinting into the sun. Ellie's eyes were narrowed, but she was smiling. There was no lie there. Or there was, but he couldn't see it. He slowly lowered the photograph back down. There were no decisions today. There were no calls. There were no plans. Just a night. Just a house. Just a father who won't give up. He turned off the light in the living room, looked into Liam's room. The boy was already fast asleep, with the tablet on his chest. Ray carefully removed it, adjusted the blanket, and went out. It was snowing outside. The world was as cold as ever. But something moved inside, not rage. Silence. Deep, like the breath before the first blow. Detroit lay dormant under the gray blanket of late autumn, its streets strewn with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot like the whisper of old promises. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and distant smoke, and the city seemed quiet, as if gathering strength for another winter. Raymond Carter sat in the battered stands of an old boxing club on the corner of Lincoln Avenue, his elbows on his knees, his eyes glued to the ring where two young men were trading blows, their gloves thumping like drums in the silence. Beside him sat Liam, his son not by blood, but by heart small, a tablet in his lap, but for the first time in a long time, his fingers off the screen. He looked at the ring, his eyes glittering, reflecting the light of the dim lamps hanging above the ceiling, and in that light Raymond saw not only a reflection, but also hope fragile as ash, but still alive. The year had been tough, like a fight where every round takes away more than you can give. Raymond had been through hell. Ellie's diary, her lies about Liam, James's confession in prison, the truth about his infertility, the shadow of the red veil that led to answers but left more questions. He had been the perfect target for lies, for pain, for other people's decisions. But for Liam, he had become a shield, a man who had chosen love over revenge, duty over rage. Now, sitting here in this club where he had once learned to fight, where sweat and blood were his language, Raymond felt that the fight was not over, but it had become different, quiet, internal, where victory was measured not by knockouts, but by the moments he could give to his son. The boxing club was the same as it had been when he was a kid. The peeling paint on the walls, the smell of sweat and leather, the creaking wooden stands. But he saw it differently now, not as a place where he could prove his strength, but as a sanctuary where he could be with Liam, where the boy could see that life wasn't just about pain, but about fighting for something greater. Raymond had brought Liam here for the first time, unsure if he'd like it, but the boy had watched the ring with such intent that Raymond felt a warmth in his chest, like someone had lit a candle in a dark room. Liam was quiet, his TTTT still coming out when he was nervous, but he was there, close, and that was all that mattered. Raymond looked at his son, his profile soft in the lamplight, but there were already James's features there, the cheekbones, the line of his jaw. It didn't sting the way it used to. James had been out 3 months ago, on a parole Raymond had wrung out for him for Liam's sake. He had found work as a loader in a suburban warehouse, nothing grand, but enough to keep him afloat. James had kept his word. He was an uncle, nothing more. He hadn't told Liam the truth, hadn't tried to take his father's place. Instead, he had sent gifts: a teddy bear, a set of pencils, a football with a faded Lions logo. Liam had accepted them with a sheepish smile, unsure of what they meant, and Raymond had looked at the boxes with James's address and felt not anger but a weary reconciliation. James had been a part of their lives, but only a shadow, and Raymond had learned to live with that for his son's sake. "You like it?" Raymond asked, his voice low but gentle, as if he was afraid to spoil the moment. He nodded toward the ring, where one of the guys was on guard and the other was throwing punches, his gloves flashing in the light. Liam turned to him, his eyes clear, but there was something new in them, not fear, not distance, but curiosity. "Why, yes," he said, his voice quiet but without the usual stutter. "They're fighting, but they're not angry." Raymond smiled, his hand on Liam's shoulder. "That's boxing, champ," he said. "You fight, but not out of hate. You fight to get stronger, to protect what you love." Liam nodded, his fingers tightening on the tablet, but he didn't look back at the screen. He was looking at Raymond, and there was something in that look that took Raymond's breath away. "Why, you were struggling too?" Liam asked, his voice almost a whisper. Raymond nodded, his eyes clouded with memory. "Yeah," he said, "a long time ago. Here, in this ring, and in life too, sometimes fighting isn't just about fists. Sometimes it's just not giving in." Liam was silent, his eyes locked on his father, and Raymond felt this moment becoming more than just a conversation. He wanted to say more about how he had struggled with the truth, with the pain, with himself, for Liam, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just sat there, feeling the warmth of his son next to him, and that was enough. The months after James's release were like walking a tightrope. Raymond kept an eye on his brother, waiting for him to break his promise, but James held on. He called once a week, asking about Liam, but he never crossed the line. His voice on the phone was tired, but without the usual mockery, as if prison had truly burned part of who he was out of him. Raymond didn't forgive him, but he had learned to endure not for James's sake, but for Liam's, who didn't have to bear the burden of their past. The red veil still loomed on the horizon, a dark spot, but Raymond had stopped his investigation. Lester, the lawyer, had found little. The eerie clinic where Liam had been conceived was indeed connected to the club, but the trail led to shadows, people who could not be found, deals that could not be proven. Carver, the name Tommy had mentioned, was a ghost, lost in rumors and whispers. Raymond knew that Ellie's death might not have been an accident, but he also knew that to dig deeper would be to risk Liam. He had chosen his son over the truth, and this was his silent fight, a fight where victory was measured not in answers, but in the safety of the boys sleeping in the next room. Raymond returned to work at the factory, his hands once again accustomed to the weight of metal, the rhythm of the machines. Life had settled into a routine, but it was different now. He picked Liam up from school, helped him with his homework, sat with him in front of the television while the boy fell asleep against his shoulder. These moments were like a light shining through the ashes of his past, and Raymond clung to them like a life preserver. In the stands of the boxing club, the lights mingled with the shadows, creating patterns on the wooden floor, as if the ring were a tableau of their lives' light and shadow, struggle and peace. Raymond looked at Liam, feeling time slow down, as if this moment was a gift he did not deserve but accepted with gratitude. The boy turned to him, his eyes serious, but there was a warmth in them that Raymond had not seen before. Daddy," Liam said, his voice quiet but clear, no stutter, no doubt. The word hung in the air like a note that lingered long after the music had stopped. Raymond froze, his heart clenching as if someone had punched him in the chest. But the punch wasn't pain, it was joy, so sharp it almost hurt. He looked at Liam, his eyes shining, but he wasn't crying. "Yes, champ," he said, his voice hoarse but soft, as if he was afraid to ruin the moment. Liam smiled, his face so open, so trusting, that Raymond felt all the pain, all the lies, all the fighting recede. "Why, you're staying?" Liam asked, his fingers tightening on the tablet, but he didn't look away. Raymond placed his hand on his son's shoulder, his fingers firm but gentle. "Always," he said, his voice a vow. "You and me, Liam. Always." Liam nodded, his smile widening as he leaned against Raymond, his head resting on his father's shoulder. Raymond held him, feeling his son's warmth flow through him, as if it could heal all the scars he bore. They sat there, looking out at the ring where the fight was still going on, but for them it was already won. The light from the lamps fell on them, mingling with the shadows, and in that light Raymond saw not only the past, but the future, imperfect, but his. Later, as they walked home, Detroit greeted them with a cold wind, but Raymond didn't feel the cold. Liam held his hand, his steps light, and in his backpack was the soccer ball James had sent him last week. Raymond looked at his son, and his heart was full not just with love, but with hope, breaking through the ashes of his past like the first shoots of spring. He knew the battles weren't over. The red veil could return, a shadow that could never be erased. James could slip, his past could catch up with them. But Raymond was ready. He was the shield, the father, the man who chose love over revenge. And as Liam called him Daddy, as they walked these streets together, he knew he had won the most important fight of all, the quiet fight where victory lay in their unity, their light, their hope. Thank you for listening to the end. If you like this story, please support it with a like and a comment. It really inspires us to create new episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. It will definitely surprise you. See you soon, and may your life be filled with more good stories. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.